unicorns and growth fairies suddenly showing that tax cuts pay for themselves. In fact, this report shows that this bill would lose more than $1 trillion even with the dynamic score. It slows the growth of the American economy after 2025. It is the total opposite of what was promised. Even with the dynamic score, what we're seeing is the sponsors of this bill spending $1 trillion and not helping those who need the help. The numbers are now in. This is the hard evidence that this bill basically isn't much more than a holiday bonanza for multinational corporations and powerful interests. I have heard a number of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle already criticizing the analysis by the Joint Committee on Taxation. I'm sure they're unhappy because this certainly unravels all of their projections, and they continue, despite the fact that the hard evidence is in, they're still saying that their tax plan is going to produce a magical unicorn and rainbow fantasy of economic growth. The facts are now in. The Republican plan loses $1 trillion. This Republican plan slows economic growth. The growth fantasy is over. It is over.
But the Senator, you up for a question?
As soon as I have a chance to finish my statement, then I'm happy.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to extend the courtesy that sometimes I don't get from the gentleman, but I'm happy to do it. The growth fantasy is over with this projection, and I'm happy to yield to my colleague.
Mr. President,
Senator from Texas.
I thank the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee. I know that we have other senators ready to speak. Since the senator believes that the Joint Committee on Taxation dynamic score of our tax bill is entirely accurate, would he agree with me that the score demonstrates that there is economic growth generated by tax cuts, and really what we're just talking about is how much economic growth is generated?
What I would say is, sure, there's what amounts to negligible growth, but this slows the growth of our economy after 2025. That's not what we were promised. In fact, let me just recap a little bit of the Republican promises. The Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, said this bill would generate so much growth, it would take care of the $1.5 trillion and generate $1 trillion on top of it. What a difference between Steve Mnuchin's projection of $2.5 trillion and the number that I've got on this sheet from the Joint Committee on Taxation, $407 billion worth of revenue. So I appreciate my colleague asking that. It helps us to clear up a little bit more of what is at issue. I appreciate Senator Thune being so gracious and giving me the extra time. The request, if I could, I'd say to my colleague. I would just ask unanimous consent that Senator Franken, myself, and Senator Nelson be added as co-sponsors to amendment number 1720, and I want to thank the senator from South Dakota for his thoughtfulness.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, a lot of our colleagues on the other side have come to the floor today and talked about why they don't like our tax reform bill. Many of those arguments have been focused on who benefits from it. And, of course, as is usually the case, when you start talking about any kind of an attempt to reduce taxes on the American people so that they can keep more of what they earn, keep more of the dollars in their pockets so they can decide how to spend it rather than send it to Washington, D.C., Democrats complain that it is tax cuts for the rich. Well, again, I want to point out, and this, of course, is based upon the Joint Committee on Taxation, which was just alluded to, and where they find the benefits of the tax relief going. As you can see from this chart, these represent different income groups, and the highest percentage tax cuts actually go to those in the lower and middle income groups. So if you look at who benefits from this, every income group gets a significant tax cut. But middle-income Americans do particularly well, percentage-wise, under this tax reform proposal. So the argument, again, that this is somehow simply a tax cut for the rich just doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't comport with reality. Clearly, the numbers tell a very different story. The other point I'd like to make, Mr. President, is that if you look at what we tried to accomplish in the design of this tax bill, we tried to maintain the existing progressivity in the tax code. We have one of the most progressive tax codes in the world. We have a lot of people in this country who don't have any income tax liability, some whom benefit from refundable tax credits that helps eliminate or partially eliminate their payroll tax liability as well. But this chart shows you, under our bill, when it's all said and done, who bears the tax burden in this country. In other words, the percentage of the tax liability paid by each different group of, in different income groups. So if you look at this, you can see those in the $20,000 to $50,000 range, this is again their tax burden as a percentage of the entire tax burden levied on Americans around the country. The rate drops from 4.3% to 4.1%. So those in the $20,000 to $50,000 income group, as a percentage, tax burden in the country, pay less under our proposal than they do today. If you look at the group from $50,000 to $100,000, that income group, they also, as a percentage of the entire tax burden borne by Americans, pay less under our proposal than they do today. They pay 16.9% today. Under our proposal, they will pay 16.7% of total taxes in this country. Those, on the other hand, making $100,000 or more will pay slightly more of the overall tax burden. Today, they pay 78.7%. Under our proposal, they'll pay 78.9%. So people under $100,000 are going to be paying less as a share of the overall tax burden than they currently do today. I don't know how anyone with a straight face can argue that somehow this is a tax bill that benefits those in the upper end. With respect to the arguments that are being made right now, Mr. President, regarding the joint committee release of the dynamic score, I would say the same thing that my colleague from Texas did, and I think the good news in all this is what it demonstrates is what we're trying to do here actually generates economic growth. It actually generates additional revenue for the federal treasury. Now, we can argue about how much. We happen to think that the assumptions used by the Joint Committee are not accurate because they assume that we're going to continue to grow for the next decade, our economy, at 1.9%. 1.9%. Historical averages, going back to the end of World War II, in the American economy, we have averaged somewhere between 3 and 3.5% growth. And so if you take the assumption that we're never going to do any better than 1.9% growth in the economy, then perhaps their estimate could be accurate. We happen to believe we're going to do a whole lot better than that. And we believe that if we put the right policies in place and we make America an attractive place in which to invest, that we're going to see considerably higher growth than 1.9%. So what does it take to cover the number that we created in this tax bill that would have to be paid for with additional growth in the economy? Well, it takes about 0.4% of growth, increase in average annual growth over the next decade. So what does that mean? Well, that means instead of growing at 1.9% a year for the next decade, we're going to have to grow at 2.2, 2.3%, somewhere in that ballpark, in order to not only cover this, but actually start generating revenue above and beyond what the impact of the tax cut would be on the federal budget. And so what I would simply say to my colleagues, Mr. President, is when you look at these various models that are done and the assumptions that are made, remember that the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Budget Office, the numbers that they're using assume 1.9% economic growth. I mean, I can't believe that we wouldn't have more confidence in the American economy that we could generate higher than 1.9% 3% economic growth. That is the straitjacket that constrains their models. Now, there are other models out there that have looked at this same information, the same data, looked at the same tax bill, considered the behavioral effects of that and how it would impact the economy, and come to an entirely different conclusion. In fact, the Tax Foundation has suggested that the tax bill that we have in front of us today would generate an additional $1.26 trillion in revenue over that same time period because of the additional growth that would come with it. And so what we tried to do is design a tax bill that not only delivers meaningful tax relief to middle-income families, which I think, as I just showed with the two charts, demonstrates that we do, but secondly, to put policies in place that will create conditions that are favorable to economic growth so that we can get growth back up to a more historic level. When the economy is growing at a faster rate, it means that businesses are creating jobs, better paying jobs, and if there's a competition for labor in this country, and I believe there will be, when companies start to expand, start to grow their operations, it increases the demand for labor, the price for labor goes up, and wages go up. And that's what we want to see. And that's the other thing about this bill that doesn't get talked about enough. The reduction in